December in the Wyoming mountains does not warn you. It simply closes. One moment the pass is open, gray sky, hard ground, the wagon tracks of people moving west towards something better. The next, the world goes white. Total. Absolute. A woman moves alone through the erasure, one hand on a lame horse's lead rope, the other pressed against something in her coat pocket she has carried for 6 months without opening. Below her, buried so deep in the valley's fold, it seems less built than exhaled by the mountain itself. A single amber light burns behind glass. Someone lit that lamp. Someone is waiting in a place no one is supposed to know about. She has no reason to trust it. She turns toward it anyway. And somewhere on the frozen ground between where she stands and where that light burns, her dead husband's name is already carved in fresh cedar, cut in the dark, by a hand she has never seen, belonging to a man who has spent 19 years making sure she would never find. The Rocky Mountains did not negotiate with December. They simply closed. The passes went white in absolute, swallowing the difference between sky and ground until a traveler could not tell which direction held survival, which held nothing but more white. Winifred Alcott had known this about Wyoming mountains before she ever set foot in them, had read it in letters from her sister Margot, who'd made the move to Copperfield 2 years prior, and written home to Montana with the particular enthusiasm of someone trying to make a decision sound better than its conditions warranted. Wren had filed those descriptions away, the way she filed most information useful, noted not yet applicable. December 1883. Alone on a mountain pass, with a lame horse and a wagon train disappearing into the white ahead of her, the information became applicable all at once. Drum had thrown the shoe somewhere in the last quarter mile before Gallows Pass narrowed. She felt it through the reins before she heard it a change in the bay mare's gait, a slight hitch on the right foreleg that told her what she needed to know before she dismounted to confirm it. The shoe was gone. The ground was ice over rock. Every step forward would cost the mare something she couldn't afford to lose. Wren stood in the driving snow holding Drum's lead rope, and she did the arithmetic the way she'd been doing arithmetic for 6 years alone on the Millstone Crossing Ranch, quietly without sentiment, working from what existed toward what was possible. Martin Howell. The trail boss looked back from the lead wagon with the expression of a man who had already made his calculation. He had women and children. He had a window. The valley road into Copperfield would close within the hour, and there was nothing in his arithmetic that left room for a single woman with a lame horse. He didn't say any of this. He didn't need to. Wren had been reading Practical Men her entire adult life, and what she read in Martin Howell's weathered face was necessity wearing the clothes of apology. She waved him forward before he could waste breath on the explanation. The last wagon rounded the bend. The white swallowed it. She stood alone on Gallows Pass for a moment that lasted longer than its actual duration, the way certain moments did, expanding to hold everything they needed to hold. She was 31 years old. She had sold the ranch 6 months after Edmund Alcott's funeral, packed what mattered into a trunk, and arranged to teach at the school in Copperfield because her sister had written that they needed someone, because Copperfield was far enough from Millstone Crossing that she would have to learn it rather than remember it, because Arthur had been in every corner of that ranch and she had been running out of corners. She had been riding toward a new life with reasonable determination and no particular illusions, and now she was standing in a December blizzard on Gallows Pass while the new life moved on without her. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried since the graveside service in June, and she didn't intend to start on a mountain pass in a storm where the cold would have frozen the tears to her face, and that would have been one more thing to manage. She took Drum's lead rope in her left hand, pressed her right against the coat pocket, where she'd put Arthur's last letter still sealed, written in his round, deliberate hand, the night before a mail run she hadn't known would kill him, and she began moving downhill. Down was warmer than up. Every valley had water at its lowest point. Wherever there was water, there was sometimes shelter. Drum walked beside her without complaint. This was one of the things Wren had always respected about the mare. She understood the difference between noise that served a purpose and noise that didn't, and she rarely made the second kind. They moved together through the deepening white wren, picking the line of least resistance down the slope, the horse adjusting to the footing with the careful economy of an animal that had been trusted to carry a woman alone across Montana range country for 4 years and had learned that trust was a two-way accounting. The pass had a name she hadn't thought much about when she booked passage with Howell's wagon train. Gallows Pass. She thought about it now, walking through it in the storm, and she thought about Arthur, who had died here in June when the snow was gone and the light was long and it should have been safe. A mail run, they'd told her. A standard route. He had volunteered for it, the post commander had said, with the particular care of someone delivering information that contained more than its surface. She had not asked follow-up questions. She had been standing in front of a man in a uniform telling her she was a widow, and follow-up questions had not been what she needed most in that moment. She had filed the incompleteness away the way she filed most things noted not yet processed pending more information. She was walking through the place where Arthur had died, and she didn't know exactly where that place was. She had walked through it. It had let her through. She didn't know what to do with that. The light was failing in the way mountain light failed in winter storms, not gradually, not with warning, but by erasure. She had been calculating since Drum lost the shoe how long she could walk, how cold her hands were inside the gloves, whether the body heat she was generating moving downhill would last longer than the light. The calculations were close. She didn't need them to be good, only close enough. She had run a working ranch alone through 6 Wyoming winters before Arthur took the job that moved him to routes she never fully understood. And close enough had been the standard for most of that work, close enough to get through the season, close enough to keep the operation running until the numbers improved, close enough to stay. She saw the light before she registered what it was. It came from below, from deep in the cup of the valley where the tree line thickened and the snow had drifted into shapes that only gradually resolved from natural to constructed. Amber. Not cold blue-white like lightning, not the silver shimmer of moonlight on snow. Amber was the color of something burning behind glass, contained deliberate, the color of a lamp someone had lit inside a building and left burning because they lived there. It came from a structure so settled into the valley's fold that it seemed less built than accumulated, as if the mountain had exhaled it across many winters. Stone chimney, a wedge of window glass visible through the gap in the drifted snow smoke, rising with the steady patience of a fire that had been going for hours. Wren moved toward it before she finished thinking. The time for thinking had already passed. The path down wasn't a path, it was the memory of a path, a slight thinning of the undergrowth that suggested traffic in some previous season. Drum picked her way down with the painful care of a horse favoring one foot, and Wren kept her eyes on the amber light below, and didn't let herself think about what she'd do if the building was abandoned, if the light was a lantern left hanging by someone who'd already gone, if the warmth she was moving toward turned out to be a story she'd told herself to get through the last quarter mile. The structure revealed itself more fully as she descended. Larger than it had looked from the slope, a main cabin long with a secondary building attached at the back, by a covered passage, the two connected in a way that suggested planning rather than addition. The logs were fitted with a precision visible even in failing light, in driving snow, the chinking clean, the whole thing sitting level on its foundation stones, with the settled certainty of a building that had been there long enough to stop arguing with the ground beneath it. Someone had built this understanding that they intended to stay. A lean-to stable tucked against the back wall caught the least wind. She brought Drum around to it, pushed the door open, and the smell of hay and horse came out warm and immediate. The smell of animals living comfortably, of a space maintained for the purpose it served. A single coal lantern hung from the center beam already lit the flame steady. One horse occupied the far stall, a large bay gelding, with the broad chest and the calm eyes of a working animal that had been well cared for across many miles. The tack on the pegs beside his stall was oiled, the leather supple, the buckles free of rust. Someone paid attention here. Someone had learned that what you maintained was what held when you needed it. She settled Drum into the empty stall, quickly pulling the saddle and the soaked blanket beneath it, finding the dry blanket folded over the rail as if it had been left for exactly this contingency, covering the mare with it, checking the foreleg in the lantern light swollen above the fetlock tender when she pressed but not broken. Rest warmth. Drum dropped her nose toward the hay with the unhurried intention of an animal deciding the crisis was concluded. Wren took slightly longer to reach the same conclusion. She went to the cabin. She knocked. The wind pulled the sound apart. She knocked harder, hard enough to feel the impact through her gloves, and called out clearly, "Hello, I'm caught in the storm. My horse is in your stable. I mean no harm to anyone in this house." She waited through the silence. Wind, snow ticking against the window glass. She put her hand on the latch. The door was not locked. She pushed it open and stepped inside. The warmth came first before she saw anything. A physical thing pressing against her face and hands with the specific mercy of a temperature differential, large enough to feel like contact. The main room was long ceiling, low lit by a fire in a wide stone hearth, and a single oil lamp on the table. Bookshelves covered two walls full without being disordered, organized by some logic she couldn't immediately read. The furniture was heavy, plainly made, obviously handmade, but the quality of the joinery was visible even in the dimness. A rocking chair near the fire with rockers that curved in a single continuous sweep. A table with legs turned on a lathe with the kind of precision that came from either exceptional natural ability or years of practice, most likely the intersection of both. Three things registered before she had taken 4 steps into the room. A woman's shawl draped over the rocking chair. Dark blue wool fine made, carrying the specific quality of dust that settled on things preserved rather than used, maintained because they couldn't be given up rather than because they were needed. A row of toys arranged on the high shelf above the bookcase, a wooden horse with proportions precise enough to suggest the maker knew horses, rather than merely what horses were supposed to look like. A set of painted blocks in fading primary colors. A small rag doll positioned with the same careful orderliness as the books below it, all of them clean in the particular way of objects kept rather than played with. On the mantel above the fire, a daguerreotype in a wooden frame face down. Wren had seen enough of the inside of a life to understand what a face-down photograph meant. She didn't touch it. She called out again, stepping further from the door. "I apologize for entering without permission. The door was unlocked. My mare lost a shoe near the top of the pass. She couldn't go further in this weather. I've put her in your stable in the far stall and used the blanket on the rail." Footsteps then, not from the front of the cabin, but from the back, from the direction of the secondary building she'd noticed from outside. A door in the back wall opened, a workshop door, she understood, catching the brief smell of fresh sawdust and linseed oil before it closed, and the man who stepped through it was pulling a canvas apron over his head with one hand, while the other hand reached for nothing at all. The reaching for nothing was the first thing that eased the tension across her shoulders. He was tall in the way of a frame built by sustained physical labor rather than bulk accumulated for its own sake. Sandy brown hair shot through with silver that had arrived earlier than his age, warranted the kind of silver that came from something other than years. His face was weathered in the particular way of someone who spent most of his time outside, in all weather, by choice rather than circumstance. Late 30s, maybe the edge of 40, though the silver made the calculation uncertain. He wore plain working clothes, well made and practical, with sawdust on both forearms and a fresh cut on the back of his left hand that he hadn't yet noticed. His eyes were the last thing she registered, and then the only thing, one brown, one green. Not by accident, or rather by an accident of nature that looked, when you encountered it, like a deliberate design decision. Disorienting in a way she hadn't anticipated, standing in a stranger's home in a storm, looking for the eye to settle on and finding she couldn't choose. He looked at her the way a careful man looked at something that needed categorizing before it could be properly responded to. Not unfriendly, not hostile, simply thorough. He took in the wet coat, the hat heavy with melted snow, the fact of her solitude, the absence of any weapon at her hip or in her hands. He took in her face, which was doing its best to communicate precisely what she was, a woman caught in a storm cold in the functional way, rather than the panicked way in need of warmth, and not much else. Silas Vane. His voice was quieter than his size suggested, working against the wind that found the window gaps. He moved toward the kitchen without asking if she was hungry, which she was. She peeled off her gloves and moved to the fire. The warmth moved up through her palms and into her arms, and she gave herself 30 seconds to simply receive it, 30 seconds of pure physical gratitude before she needed to be useful again. Winifred Alcott. She turned her gloves toward the heat to dry. Thea, she had been called her whole life. Then she remembered she had not been called that. Here had not introduced herself that way, corrected herself. Wren. She had been Wren since girlhood, since her older sister Margot had declared Winifred too much name for such a small person. She was traveling with a party from Millstone Crossing, Montana to Copperfield. Her horse lost a shoe near the top of the pass. By the time she had drums settled, the wagon couldn't wait. She followed the valley down and found his light. He set a bowl on the table without ceremony. Beef stew with root vegetables and some herbs she couldn't immediately name, the kind of cooking that indicated someone who paid attention, who had learned that time and a bay leaf, and something she thought might be time, were the difference between food and a meal. He poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot on the back of the stove and placed one near her and stepped back to the kitchen alcove with the quality of distance that said he was giving her space to eat without the social obligation of being watched while doing it. She could pay for the stall if he named a price. He didn't look up from whatever he was doing at the kitchen counter. No price, he said. She ate. He sat in the chair near the fire and didn't watch her, which she noted as a courtesy she hadn't needed to ask for. The stew was better than the cabin's exterior had prepared her to expect, and she was hungry enough that she had to remind herself to eat at a pace that didn't reveal exactly how hungry she was. Arthur had always said you could judge a person's character by whether they bothered to season their food when there was no one to impress. She thought of Arthur, then put the thought back down with the careful deliberateness she had been practicing for 6 months, pressing it flat the way you pressed a letter back into its envelope when you weren't ready for what it said. When the bowl was empty, she wrapped both hands around the coffee cup and looked around the room properly. The books were organized by subject, she could see that now. History together, natural philosophy, together a section that looked like architecture, and surveying a longer section of literature. Most had the softened spines of books read many times. Several had paper markers at specific pages. One volume on timber framing stood slightly forward from the others, as if it had been pulled and replaced often enough to develop a habit. Beside it, a notebook with pencil diagrams visible through its half-open cover, structural sketches precise, not the doodles of someone passing time, but the working notes of someone solving problems on paper before solving them in wood. He built things. He read about building things. He had built this room well enough that it had opinions about timber framing. "You've lived here long," she said. 5 years come spring. He'd built most of it himself, he said, foundation stones with help, because stonework was its own art, and he knew his limitations. But the joinery was excellent, the rocking chair especially. Something shifted in his posture fractionally, the way a person shifted when they received a specific compliment rather than a general one. His father had been a carpenter in Pennsylvania, he said. Believed a man should know how to build something lasting. Said it was the only argument against impermanence that held up under honest examination. That was a very precise thing for a carpenter to say, she said. He was a precise man, Silas said. A pause that held more weight than its length. He would have had opinions about the foundation stones, too, if he'd lived to see them. She didn't ask when his father had died. There were questions you earned the right to ask, and questions that didn't belong on the first night, when you were a stranger inside a stranger's house, and the storm outside made leaving temporarily impossible. "What brought you to Wyoming from Pennsylvania?" she asked instead. The fire shifted. He looked at it. The war moved him west, he said, a lot of men after. You found that the place you'd come from didn't fit anymore, and you kept walking until you found a place that fit better. He looked at her then directly, and she had the experience again of not knowing which eye to settle on. The brown one absorbed the firelight. The green one sent it back. What took her to Copperfield, a teaching position? The school needed someone. Her sister had written about it. She arranged the next sentences before speaking them the way she arranged things she'd said enough times that they needed to stay from sounding rehearsed. Her husband Arthur and she had run a cattle ranch near Millstone Crossing for 6 years. He had taken a job with the Territorial Postal Service 4 years ago. Routes she never fully knew work that kept him moving. He passed in June. She couldn't stay on the ranch. Too much of him in every corner. She needed somewhere new enough that she would have to learn it rather than remember it. Silas went very still when she said Arthur's name. Not frozen, the controlled stillness of someone managing something. He said Arthur Alcott. Slowly. Testing each syllable against something internal, the way you tested ice before trusting it with weight. From Millstone Crossing. Yes. She watched him. Did he know Arthur? He stood. He moved to the window and looked at the snow still falling, the snow that would fall through the night. His back was to her. When he spoke, his voice had changed in some way she couldn't immediately categorize. Not broken, not roughened, simply weighted differently, as if the words cost more than they had a moment before. He was sorry for her loss, he said. It was a complete sentence. It was not an answer. She noticed that it was not an answer. She also noticed that his hands visible at his sides had closed into fists that he didn't appear aware of. She waited. He said nothing more. She made the decision not to push it, not on this first night when she still needed warmth and shelter, and the storm was still deciding how long it intended to stay. Some things needed time to arrive at. Arthur had taught her that, or rather, living with Arthur had taught her the long, patient work of learning another person from the inside out, understanding that the most important information was rarely the first to surface. The road will be closed for several days, she said, returning to the surface of things. She knew that. He turned from the window. The discomfort she had glimpsed for a moment was mostly gone, replaced by something steadier. These mountains weren't forgiving to people who gambled with winter storms, he said. There were 3 bedrooms. She should take whichever suited her. He paused. He would check on her horse before he turned in. She had named the mare Drum. She would take an apple if he had one. She wasn't above a bribe when she wanted something. Something almost happened on his face. Not quite a smile. The preparation for one, the muscles organizing themselves toward a shape they'd arrived at before, but seemed to need a moment to find. He would see what he could find, he said. She helped wash the bowl and cups. He didn't argue about it, which suggested his hospitality was practical rather than performative. She took the lamp he offered. The room at the end of the hall was plain and clean. A narrow bed with a quilt that had been made by someone who knew what they were doing. A washstand with pitcher and basin. A window that showed nothing but dark and driving snow. On the wall, someone had mounted a small shelf at exactly the height where it would be most useful, the kind of addition that came from actually inhabiting a space rather than designing it in the abstract. She set the lamp on the shelf. She sat on the edge of the bed and removed her boots and coat and the 2 wool layers beneath. For a long moment, she simply sat in the warmth and let herself feel the full weight of the day, the cold, the lost wagon train. Drum's careful, painful progress down the mountain, the amber light appearing in the exact moment she'd needed it to appear, which Arthur would have called providence. She had always called it something like luck, without entirely disagreeing with him. She pressed her right hand briefly against the outside of her coat pocket, against the shape of the letter inside it. Still sealed. She had been carrying it for 6 months, and she hadn't opened it yet, and she wasn't going to open it tonight. She lay down and pulled the quilt up and listened to the storm. After a while, from outside, the sound of a stable door. Silas, true to his word, going to check on Drum. She heard nothing after that for a time. The wind found different gaps in the eaves, different registers working through its range. She had almost crossed into sleep when she heard a sound from the direction of the workshop. Small, rhythmic, deliberate. A hand tool working wood in the middle of the night, not with the urgency of someone finishing a deadline, but with the quality of someone who needed their hands occupied, because occupied hands were the only thing keeping them out of somewhere else. She understood that. 3 months after Arthur's funeral, she had rearranged every piece of furniture in the Millstone Crossing ranch house across consecutive sleepless nights, room by room, for no reason she could have explained to anyone who asked. She didn't get up. She lay in the dark of a stranger's spare room listening to Silas Vane work in his shop in the middle of a blizzard, and at some point, she crossed into sleep without deciding to. Morning came pale, the storm still going, but changed lower, less aggressive. The white outside the window softer. She stood, and her left ankle informed her, with the sharp specificity of a joint that had been saving its complaint for when she stopped moving, that she had turned it somewhere on the icy path down from the pass. She had been too cold to register the injury at the time, too focused on the next step and the step after that. She registered it now. Bearable. Not broken. Simply the body submitting an invoice for what the previous night had cost. She dressed and put up her hair and went to the washstand where the pitcher held water. That was not frigid. Silas had brought fresh water at some point that morning. Another quiet act of attention she was beginning to recognize as his mode. She went to the main room and found coffee on the stove and a plate of biscuits covered with a cloth on the table. No Silas. The workshop doors stood slightly ajar. She heard nothing from inside. The night's work was finished. The man who'd done it was somewhere else outside maybe, or in the stable with the horses. She stood in the main room with a cup of coffee, not moving toward the workshop door, not moving away from it. Then she crossed to it and pushed it open enough to see inside. The workshop was organized with the same logic as the main room. Every tool on its designated peg, the workbenches cleared of debris, the smell of cedar and linseed oil and something else she thought might be pine resin. On the center workbench, among the larger pieces Silas had apparently been working on, table legs, shelf brackets, things in various stages of completion, there was a small object that had not existed yesterday. A piece of cedar the size of her palm face, smooth back, still raw. Into the smooth face someone had cut letters with a fine chisel. The lettering was clean measured, each character taking the space it required, and no more. The work of a person who understood that letters carved in wood were permanent, so each stroke needed to be decided before it was made. She read the name from 3 feet away, standing in the doorway with her coffee cup in both hands. Arthur. Her husband's name carved into a piece of fresh cedar by a man who had gone silent when she spoke it. A man who claimed only that the war had moved him west. A man whose hands had closed into fists he hadn't noticed when she said the words, "My husband Arthur passed in June." She stood in the workshop doorway for a long time. The cedar piece sat in the center of the workbench, as if placed there with the care of something significant, something that had needed to exist in the physical world, rather than only in the interior one. She stepped back into the main room. She was standing at the stove refilling her coffee when she heard his boots on the covered passage from the stable. The door opened. He came in and she looked at him across the kitchen, and he looked at her, and the conversation they had been having underneath the surface of their actual conversation shifted beneath them both like ice adjusting to new weight. The ankle was giving her trouble, she said. She must have turned it coming down from the pass without registering it. She didn't think she could make the valley road today. He looked at her foot, then went to the chest along the wall and opened it, and took out a roll of linen bandage and a small tin she recognized by its shape and color as arnica salve. He pulled a chair close to the fire and indicated it with the slight movement of his head that she was already learning as his version of an invitation. She sat. He knelt and examined the ankle with the brisk efficiency of a man who had done this before, not tenderly, not awkwardly, simply with the confidence of someone assessing something they needed to assess honestly. His hands checked the joint, tested the range of motion, concluded. 3 days minimum, he said, settling back. Maybe 4. The valley road would be closed at least that long regardless. She looked at him levelly. I see. Then I'll try not to be in the way. He stood, turning back to the stove. She wasn't in the way, he said. She ate her biscuits and drank her coffee. He sat in his chair near the fire and opened a book. The storm filled the silence between them with enough sound that neither was obligated to fill it with conversation, which was its own kind of mercy. After a while, she went to the shelves and selected a book, The History of Wyoming Territory, its spine soft from repeated use. She sat at the table with it. She opened the front cover. Previous owners sometimes wrote their names. There was writing, not the precise left-leaning hand she'd seen on the labels of Silas's tool storage, but something rounder, hurried with a rightward slant. She noticed the way she noticed things she wasn't yet sure she was noticing. The inscription read, "To sigh good reading for a man who finally found his valley. A Fort Decker, November 1864. A. She set the book down carefully with the care of someone managing the speed at which they arrived at a conclusion. She selected another book from the shelf. No inscription. The third sigh, finish this before I get back and we'll argue about it. A. No date, no location. She chose 4 more over the next few minutes, methodical, unhurried, the way she moved through a ranch ledger looking for a discrepancy she suspected was there. 2 had nothing. The 4th had it again. AA to SV 1863. Keep it safe. 6 books, the same handwriting, the same initials. A. Arthur Alcott had been a man who believed that books should move between people who would use them, who had once told her that keeping a book to yourself when someone else needed it was a form of hoarding he had no patience for. He had given books away his entire life. He had given them to Fort Decker in 1864 to a man he called Cy, a man whose last name began with V, who lived now in a hidden Wyoming valley and had gone still as winter stone when a woman said her dead husband's name. She placed the Wyoming history back on the shelf. She selected a different book and brought it to the table and opened it, and she read without reading, while across the room Silas Vane turned no pages in his own book for 20 solid minutes. She read 4 more pages of the book she wasn't reading before she heard his boots shift on the floor and looked up to find him watching her. Not with the cataloging attention of the previous night, but with something more specific. The look of a man who had spent the last 20 minutes deciding something and had arrived at a conclusion he wasn't certain he was ready to act on. She met his eyes across the length of the room, the brown one and the green one both doing what they did in firelight, the brown absorbing it, the green returning it, so that he always seemed to be looking at you with 2 different qualities of attention simultaneously. "You went into the workshop," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact between 2 people who both already knew the fact, which was its own kind of conversation. "The door was open," she said. Her voice was even. She had learned a long time ago that the useful thing about being even-voiced was that it left the other person room to fill the silence however their conscience directed. She set the book down on the table and waited. He looked at the fire. His jaw worked once slightly the way a jaw worked when a person was deciding between 2 versions of what to say next. Then he said, A is Arthur Alcott. 4 words, each one placed deliberately like stones, set into a foundation that needed to bear weight it hadn't been designed for. The room was quiet except for the fire and the wind finding the eave gaps in its patient way. Wren's hands were flat on the table. She didn't move them. She said, "Tell me how you knew him." Silas closed his book. He set it on the side table with the deliberateness of someone who needed something to do with his hands while his mind caught up to the moment. Then he sat forward, elbows on his knees, mismatched eyes, finding a point on the floor between them. And he began without preamble, without the softening language people used when they needed to confess something. He simply started the way you started walking toward a thing you'd been walking away from for long enough that the walking toward felt like relief, even when it also felt like falling. They had served together in the Union Courier Corps, he said. Arthur himself, his younger brother Owen. The 3 of them rode the same routes from 1863 through late 1864 territory between Fort Decker and the Eastern Outpost country that most men wouldn't take alone, which was why command sent them in 3s. Owen was 22 when he enlisted. Too young, too transparent, wearing everything he felt on his face, which was a liability when you were carrying dispatches through ground where Confederate scouts watched patterns of movement. Arthur used to say Owen would have made either a magnificent preacher or a terrible poker player, and that both assessments amounted to the same thing. It had made Owen laugh every time. He never seemed to tire of the joke, which told you something about Owen. He loved being known, being read clearly, even when the reading was unflattering, because it meant someone was paying close enough attention to see him. Wren kept her hands flat on the table. She did not interrupt. Owen died on the route to Fort Decker, Silas said. May of 1864, a Confederate ambush at Gallows Pass. The same pass she had ridden through last night in the blizzard, cursing the wind, the ice, the lost shoe, the way the mountains closed without warning or apology. She had walked through the place where a 22-year-old boy had died and hadn't known it, had only known it as an obstacle between herself and where she was going. The knowledge settled into her chest now with a specific weight. Arthur found Owen first. Silas's voice stayed level, but level the way deep water stayed level, the surface calm, while the current beneath it was doing something entirely different. He rode back to where Silas was waiting at the lower camp. He didn't speak when he came in. He simply sat down on the ground outside the tent, not on the camp stool, not on the log the men used as a bench on the ground, as if his legs had made a quiet decision. And Silas knew from the way he sat down what the news was before a word was said. They buried Owen there. Arthur carved the grave marker by lantern light, 3 hours of work, because they didn't have enough lamp oil to waste, and he did most of it by feel, and the letters he cut were as clean and measured as if he'd done it in full daylight with all the time in the world. Wren thought of the cedar piece on the workbench. Arthur. Each letter taking the space it required no more. She thought of what Silas had learned about what a grave marker cost, what you owed the dead, in terms of the time you spent on the thing that would speak for them after you were gone. After Owen Silas said he had not been in a condition to be useful for several weeks. He said it plainly without qualifying it or explaining it further, which was more honest than any qualifying would have been. Arthur kept him functional. That was the accurate way to say it. Kept him writing, kept him eating, made him read. Moved books back and forth between them. Said a man whose mind was occupied was a man whose mind wasn't in a hole. He was right. He was usually right about the things that mattered less, right about the things that didn't, which was its own kind of precision. Silas drank for 2 months badly at the beginning, and Arthur sat with him through the worst of it with the patience of someone who understood that what he was sitting with wasn't weakness, but damage. And those were different things that required different responses. One morning, Silas woke to find Arthur had poured out what remained of the bottle, and every bottle that had accumulated alongside it without saying anything, without making a ceremony of it. And that morning was the last time Silas drank. He asked Arthur why that particular morning. Arthur said because Wren is holding everything together at home, and I don't have the right to make her work harder than it already is. The fire shifted, exhaling through a gap in the grate. Wren pressed her hands more firmly against the table, not because she needed the support, but because her hands needed something to press against. She had known those months from the other side, had felt them without knowing their shape. The letters arriving less frequently, the ones that did arrive shorter, and somehow lighter than Arthur's letters usually were, as if someone were writing in his handwriting, but leaving out the specific weight of him. She had found the bottles twice in the tack room, once in the space behind the loose board in the barn floor that she'd discovered entirely by accident and never mentioned finding. She'd poured each one out and never asked. She had understood with the instinct of a woman who paid close attention to the man she loved that asking would transform it into something he needed to defend rather than something he could simply stop. He'd stopped. She had believed it was because of her. It had been because of her. But the mechanism of it, the specific morning, and the words spoken and the decision made that had happened in a place she had never seen, between her husband and a man with mismatched eyes, and she was learning about it 19 years later in a hidden Wyoming valley while a blizzard worked at the windows. He talked about you constantly, Silas said, and something in his voice shifted again, the weight redistributed. He was specific about it. Said your laugh started low and went somewhere unexpected, some direction that didn't follow from how it began. Said you hummed when you worked, but never any songs straight through. You took the pieces you liked and skipped the rest. He paused briefly. We teased him about it. Even Owen before Silas stopped. Even Owen used to tease him. Arthur didn't mind. Said a man who was embarrassed by loving his wife had his priorities arranged in the wrong order. Wren looked at the fire rather than at Silas. She didn't trust her face in that moment. There was a November night in 1864. Silas said, his voice taking on the careful cadence of something that had been turned over so many times, its edges had smoothed without losing their weight. A dispatch from Fort Decker to the Eastern Outpost Intelligence about Confederate movement through the southern passes. Critical narrow window of usefulness. The route went through Gallows Pass. Silas had made that ride 6 times. He knew the terrain, the timing, the specific places where Confederate units had set ambushes before the variations they'd developed over the previous months. He'd been mapping those variations on paper, building a picture. He knew that pass the way you knew something you'd staked your life on repeatedly. He had been sick for 3 days before the dispatch came. Fever the kind that made sitting a horse a serious risk rather than a manageable discomfort. Arthur came to the room where Silas was quartered and looked at him once and said he would go. Silas told him no. Told him to request reassignment through the commanding officer, that the dispatch could wait a day. Arthur said it couldn't wait. Said the intelligence had a narrow window and they both knew what narrow meant in that context, and said you're ill. I'm not. The arithmetic is simple. Silas told him the route was more dangerous than it had been, that the Confederate units had been varying their positions in ways that made riding it without the specific pattern knowledge he'd accumulated a different risk than riding it with that knowledge. Arthur heard him. He listened the way he listened to everything important, completely without interrupting, without his eyes moving away. Then he went anyway. They found him at Gallows Pass, Silas said. The same location as Owen. The storm outside had shifted register during the telling, finding a lower frequency against the glass. Wren sat in it. She had ridden through that pass last night without knowing she was riding through it twice. She thought about the ice, the wind, the lost shoe, the specific moment she had looked at the white ahead of her, where the wagon train had gone, and understood she was alone. She had been alone in the place that had made her alone. She had walked through it, and it had let her through, and she didn't know what to make of that, except that it was the kind of coincidence Arthur would have called something more than coincidence, and she wasn't sure she disagreed with him. He knew, she said. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. Before he went. He knew there was significant risk, and he went because of you. A silence. Then yes. She stood. Sitting still was not possible anymore in the specific way that sitting still was sometimes not possible, the body's refusal to remain contained when something large was moving through it. She went to the window, not the one Silas had stood at before, a different one, the one that faced north toward where Gallows Pass would be if you could see anything through the white. She looked at nothing. Arthur had made a decision in a moment she hadn't been part of, for a reason she now understood completely, and that decision had moved through 19 years to deposit her in a hidden valley in a blizzard, with her ankle wrapped and her husband's name carved on someone's workbench. She didn't know how to hold all of that simultaneously. She was going to need time. She turned from the window. Silas was still near the mantel, not looking at her, his profile to the room, the fire doing its usual work on his eyes. He looked like a man who had been standing in a particular place inside himself for 19 years and had learned to stand there without moving, because to move in any direction would require choosing a direction, and choosing required believing there was somewhere worth going. I should check on Drum, she said. She took her coat from the peg and went out before he could respond. The stable was cold after the cabin, but not brutally so. 2 horses generated enough warmth to take the killing edge off the air. She went to Drum's stall and put her forehead against the mare's neck and stayed there with her eyes closed, breathing the smell of horse and hay, feeling the steady warmth of the animal's living body against her face. She did not cry. The cold air helped. It made breathing deliberate enough that there was no surplus left for anything else. She stood with her forehead against Drum's neck, and she thought about Arthur riding through Gallows Pass in November of 1864, knowing the risk doing it anyway because the arithmetic was simple. She had always known he was brave. She had not known what shape the bravery had taken on that specific morning, had not known it was the shape of a sick man's cot in a military camp, and her husband looking at the man in it and making a decision she had spent 6 months not fully understanding because she had never had all of the information. She had the information now. She was not sure yet what to do with understanding it. She stood in the stable until the cold began working its way through her coat, then went back inside. When she came through the door, Silas had moved to the kitchen. He was making tea, his back to the room, and the set of his shoulders carried the specific tension of someone waiting to learn what came next. She hung up her coat. She sat at the table. She said, "The books on your shelves. Several of them have inscriptions from Arthur." He brought the teapot to the table without turning. He set down 2 cups and sat across from her. Arthur had given him the books across 1863 and 1864, he said, at Fort Decker, at camp, other places. Arthur believed books should travel between people who needed them. He gave them to Silas as he finished each one, and Silas gave others in return, and Arthur took those back to Montana. He didn't know if any of them were still at the ranch. She thought of the shelf in the Millstone Crossing house, the books she had packed into a crate when she sold the property, the crate now at Margot's house in Copperfield. She had never looked at the inscriptions. She had packed the books the way she packed most things in those months, quickly, without examining, because examining required more of her than she had to spend. "You stayed here," she said, "after the war. You came to Wyoming and built this place, and have been here 5 years. He went home to Pennsylvania first," he said. His father had died while he was gone. The house was sold, no siblings to coordinate with. Nothing requiring him to stay, which could have read as loss, but read instead as instruction, the place telling him something worth listening to. He spent 2 years moving west by stages millwork, mostly then building work, when he could find contractors who needed someone who could read a structural plan. He ended up in Wyoming because a man he'd worked with in Kansas said the mountains were the only thing left in the country large enough to be worth looking at, and Silas had developed by then a requirement for large things. She wrapped her hands around the tea. The cup was the same weight and temperature as the coffee cup had been the night before, and she noticed the parallel without remarking on it, the way she was noticing many things she wasn't yet remarking on. "You tried not to be found," she said. "After the war. Arthur looked for you." The cup stilled in his hands. His neighbor told him eventually that a man had come asking. He said. By the time she mentioned it, Silas had already moved on to Ohio for millwork. He'd told himself he'd missed Arthur by chance. A pause that acknowledged the inadequacy of what it was holding. That wasn't entirely true. You knew he might come. He knew Arthur. If Arthur survived the war and Silas had been listed as missing, Arthur would come. That was who he was. His voice carried something that was too honest to be bitterness and too specific to be mere sadness, the sound of a man who had made a deliberate choice with full understanding and had been living inside its consequences ever since. "I was not ready," he said, "to stand in front of the man whose wife no longer had a husband because of me." He looked at her directly, then both eyes, all that contradictory light. "I thought if you knew the circumstances that Arthur had ridden that route in my place, you would spend whatever remained of your life angry at someone you'd never met. That seemed like a worse addition to your life than my absence. That was not your decision to make," Wren said. The words landed without force but with weight. She had not raised her voice. She never raised her voice when she was most serious about something had learned years ago, that quiet traveled further than volume and arrived in better condition. The words landed and he felt them. She could see it in the stillness that came over him, a different quality of stillness than before. "No," he said. "It wasn't." She looked at the locked drawer in the desk under the bookshelves. She had noticed it the first morning, registered the brass lock, filed it. She looked at it now with the directness of someone who had decided that the time for filing things away had passed. He followed her gaze. He produced a small key from his vest pocket, crossed to the desk. He opened the drawer and stood with his back to her for a moment before he took out what was inside. A paper envelope, the corners yellow with age, the wax seal long dried and separated from the pressure of years. He held it in both hands for a moment with the lightness of someone touching something they weren't certain they were allowed to touch. Then he crossed back to the table and set it in front of her. The handwriting on the front was Arthur's. She recognized it before she could have said how, not from the specific shapes of the letters, but from something in their arrangement, the particular way he put words on paper, the evidence of the mind behind them. He had written Wren of mine. Not Wren, not Mrs. Alcott. Wren of mine, his specific possessive, the one that had never meant ownership, but something closer to belonging to. "I am the one who belongs to you." She pressed her lips together and said nothing. "He wrote it the night before the Fort Decker run," Silas said. "Gave it to him in case he didn't come back." Silas hadn't had her address in Millstone Crossing. Arthur had meant to give it separately, hadn't. Every year since Silas had told himself he would find a way. Every year he hadn't found it. She held the envelope without opening it. "Not yet," she said. "Not with him watching." Whatever Arthur had written in there was the most private document that had ever existed between them, and she needed to come to it alone in the dark, without the weight of being observed. He nodded once, a single motion, the nod of a man who understood exactly what she meant. The day moved through its winter hours. Wren read or made the gestures of reading, turning pages at intervals that had nothing to do with her comprehension. Silas worked at the desk, the architectural drawings she'd noticed before, lines executed with the focus of a man who needed his concentration, entirely occupied. The storm found new registers outside. The fire required tending. These were the facts of the afternoon, the surface of it, while beneath the surface, the conversation that had happened in the morning settled into both of them like groundwater finding its level. Around 4, when the mountain light had begun its early collapse toward dark, she put down her book and said, "Teach me something." He looked up from the desk. "In the workshop," she said. "You were cutting something last night. Show me how." He looked at her the way he looked at most things before responding to them, the slight recalibration of someone who had expected something different and was adjusting to what had actually arrived. He dried his hands on a work cloth. He led her to the workshop. He gave her a piece of soft pine, a flat chisel, a wooden mallet. He showed her the angle of the blade against the grain, the amount of force that was suggestion rather than demand. The way the wood told you immediately when you were wrong rather than letting the error accumulate. Her first 3 cuts were wrong in different ways, too deep, then too shallow, then skewed by a wrist that hadn't learned yet how to maintain a line under pressure. He corrected each without making a production of the correction. A slight adjustment to her grip. A hand briefly over hers to demonstrate the pressure required, then withdrawn. No commentary, no reassurance. Just the adjustment clean, then the expectation that she would apply it. "Why does this help?" she asked. The 4th cut was better. The wood came away cleanly, a thin curl of pine that fell to the bench and sat there like something completed. "Because the wood tells you immediately when you've made a mistake," he said. He was working a piece of his own, alongside her, a different tool, but the same material. There's no ambiguity. The error shows up in the surface, and you see it, and you correct it. Everything else is less clear about when you've gone wrong. A beat. Sometimes by a significant margin. She considered that making the 5th cut. She kept her eyes on the wood. "You've been in this valley 5 years," she said. "Reading the books, building the furniture, riding out wherever you ride. You haven't gone to pieces from it. Some days the assessment is less definitive than others," he said. "But I get up every day. Getting up is the one thing I haven't found a reason to stop doing. Everything else has been open to revision." She put that beside the other things he'd said that were worth keeping in the internal space where she put things worth keeping. That night alone in the spare room with the lamp turned low, she opened Arthur's letter. He had written it quickly. She could see that, in the uneven pressure of the pen, the letter slightly less formed than his careful inscriptions in the books Silas had shown her. He'd written it in whatever space was available to him in a military camp, with the specific knowledge of a man who understood he might not return from what he was about to do. He wrote that he was sorry, that he had spent years carrying things he should have shared with her, and the carrying had bent him in ways she had seen and he had refused to name. He wrote about Owen, who had been the most purely alive person he'd ever known, and about the 2 months after Owen when he hadn't been able to hold his own shape without help, and about Silas sitting beside him through the worst of those months, in the way that only someone who was also inside the same damage could sit beside another person without making it worse. He wrote that he was sorry for the drinking, not in the way people apologized to be absolved, but in the way people apologized when they had genuinely done wrong and wanted the record to reflect that accurately. He wrote about Silas, said he was the best man Arthur had ever ridden beside, said he was ill and the arithmetic was simple, and he had made the decision before he finished thinking about it, because some decisions were like that. They arrived complete already made, and you only discovered what you'd chosen when you heard yourself speaking. At the end he wrote, "If I don't come home, find Silas Vane. Not because I'm asking you to do anything particular with what you find. A dead man's wishes are a form of arrogance I hope I can mostly avoid, but because Silas will tell you who I actually was. Not the husband I tried to be, or the man I wanted you to see. The man I was, the one who was afraid, who drank in the dark, who cried once where he thought no one could see him, who got up every single morning anyway, and who loved you with a completeness I never found adequate language for. I would like you to know him if you can manage it. I think you'd find him worth knowing." She sat with the letter for a long time after she finished it. She didn't cry. She had cried in the stable that afternoon briefly, with her forehead against Drum's neck. That had been the space she designated for it, and it had been enough. The room was for something quieter, something that lived on the far side of grief once you'd moved through enough of it to reach the other bank. She thought about how much of a person could remain invisible even to the person who loved them most completely. How much of Arthur had lived in the space between the ranch and the road she'd never fully known, in the dark months when the letters came wrong and the specific morning when he'd made a decision. She'd spent 6 months not fully understanding because she'd been missing one piece of information. She had the piece now. In the morning, she came to the table carrying the letter. Silas was there with his coffee and his drawings the morning hour, when he needed his mind occupied before the day gave him something specific to occupy it with. He looked up when she set the letter on the table in front of him. He looked at her. "He wrote about you," she said. "He said you were the best man he ever rode beside. He also said," and she held Silas's gaze, both eyes, neither one, "that you would be the man who told me who he actually was." She paused. "You've been doing that since yesterday morning. I think it's time to finish it." Something moved across his face. Not relief exactly, not release, something more complex than either of those. The expression of a man who had been carrying something heavy for long enough that the prospect of setting it down had become as frightening as the weight itself. But he sat forward. He began. He told her about Arthur's anger, the specific, controlled kind that stayed leashed for months and then came loose briefly and cleanly when something genuinely unjust crossed his path, the kind Wren had seen surface in Arthur twice in their years together and had never known the full depth of. He told her about the night Arthur refused a direct order because following it would have required leaving a wounded courier on the trail, stood in front of a superior officer, and said in the same quiet voice Wren used when she was most serious that he wouldn't do it. He told her about the jokes Arthur made that were never quite comfortable, that always cut slightly towards something true. He told her about Arthur crying once, in nearly 2 years on the night they buried Owen briefly, and without theater, and how that single instance had told Silas more about Arthur's actual architecture than anything else he'd witnessed, because the men who wept precisely once, at exactly the right moment, and never otherwise were the men who understood something about proportion. Wren listened without looking away. Then she said, "You have been punishing yourself." She leaned forward slightly. "You have been living in this valley with the books Arthur gave you, and the toys Owen's boy never got to play with, and the photograph face down on the mantel, and you have been calling that honoring them." She held his eyes. "But it isn't." He stood. He moved away from the table, not pacing, but putting distance between himself and the words. "You weren't there," he said. His voice had stayed quiet, which she'd learned was when the thing he felt was largest. "You cannot stand in my house and tell me what they would or wouldn't want. Arthur made a choice that ended his life and gave me mine. Every morning when I wake up in a bed he will never sleep in again, that isn't punishment. That's simply the truth of what happened." She didn't flinch. "Arthur wrote in that letter that he wanted me to know who he actually was," she said. "He wanted that because he believed knowing the truth was better than not knowing it. You're sitting on the same belief right now and refusing to apply it to yourself." She paused. "He did not die so that you could become a monument to the fact that he died." He looked at her across the room. Both eyes. All that weight. The expression of a person who has been accurately identified and cannot decide whether to be grateful or furious about the accuracy. He picked up his coat. He went outside. She heard the workshop door open. She heard it close. She sat at the table with Arthur's letter and the sound of a mallet working against wood in the cold, patient and deliberate, and she waited. She fed the fire twice while he was outside. Not because it needed feeding twice, but because moving between the woodpile and the hearth gave her somewhere to put her hands, something her body could do while her mind worked at a slower pace through what had just happened. The cabin held its warmth. The storm outside had reduced itself to wind without snow, which was progress of a kind, not the end of winter, but the end of this particular argument between the mountains and the sky. She washed the cups from breakfast. She stood at the north-facing window for a while and looked at nothing. She didn't try to decide how she felt about what she'd said to him, because the honest answer was that she didn't regret it, and not regretting something wasn't the same as knowing whether it had been the right thing to do. The afternoon moved through its short winter span. Mountain dark came in early, the light going from gray to gray-blue to the specific dense dark of high altitude in December, the kind of dark that arrived complete rather than graduated. She lit the lamp on the table. She put more wood on the fire. She found bread in the kitchen and cheese and the remains of the stew from the previous night and put them on the table without ceremony, because she was practical about hunger when no one had thought about supper, and she had access to a kitchen. She heard the workshop door when the dark was full outside, his boots on the covered passage, The door opened and he brought in the cold air of a December evening at altitude, the sharp, particular cold that had nothing apologetic in it, and sawdust on his shirt that had not been there before, which meant he had worked rather than merely stood in the workshop being angry. His face had changed. Not resolve moved through was more accurate, the way a storm moved through, rather than resolve leaving the sky altered in ways that would hold. He went to the stove without looking at her. He poured coffee that had been sitting since morning, drank it cold without appearing to notice its temperature. Then he turned. My father built a cabinet once that took him 6 months. His voice had the quality of something set down and picked back up with a different grip. Not the same grip, not the wounded one. A different one. A piece for a woman in our town in Pennsylvania whose husband had died and left her with 4 children, 3 of them too young for school. He charged her nothing. He worked on it every evening after his paying work was done 6 months, and when it was finished, he loaded it onto a cart and delivered it, and came home and sat at the kitchen table for an hour without speaking. A pause that held the particular weight of a memory carried long enough to become structural. I asked him afterward why he'd done it. He said because she needed something solid that would outlast her grief. That's what furniture is for when it's made the right way. Ren waited. I have been making furniture for 5 years, Silas said. I have been making it very well. He looked at the table, at the chairs, at the shelves along the wall, not with pride, with recognition, the way a maker looked at their own work, and saw not the finished surface, but every decision that had gone into it. I have not been making it for anyone. She understood what he was telling her. She gave him the courtesy of not translating it back to him. They ate supper from what was on the table. Neither of them had thought to cook anything new, which was its own information about where both of them were, past the formality of the first nights, past the performance of hospitality somewhere more plainly inhabited. The bread was good. The stew was better cold than it had any right to be. They sat afterward near the fire with the silence of 2 people who had said everything necessary for the day and were now simply occupying the same space while their thoughts settled. Outside, the wind found a different angle against the eaves, lower, almost conversational. You said 3 bedrooms, Ren said eventually, not looking at him, watching the fire. When I first arrived, yes, 1 is yours, 1 is mine. She paused. What is the 3rd? He was quiet for a moment, in the particular way he was quiet when something required honest accounting rather than quick answer. I built it for guests, he said. I haven't had guests. You built a room for a thing you didn't have. The structure required it. A slight shift in his posture. The load distribution across the roofline demanded either a 3rd room or a different pitch, and I preferred the room. He turned his hands over once in the firelight, looking at them the way he sometimes looked at things he had made for error, for what could have been done better. Also, I suppose I believed that if I built it, the occasion for it might eventually arise. That's a particular kind of faith, she said. My father was a precise man. She heard the call back in it. He'd said the same thing the first night, and he knew she'd remember, and the fact that he used it again meant something about what he was doing, which was building a small structure of shared reference between them, the way you built anything 1 piece at a time, each one resting on the one before. She turned to face him properly. The teaching position in Copperfield, she said. I confirmed it before the storm. My sister is expecting me. The Valley Road will open tomorrow if the wind holds at this angle. He looked at the fire. Likely tomorrow afternoon, he agreed, or by morning if the temperature didn't drop again before dawn. Then I'll leave in the morning. She held his gaze when he looked up. But I want to say something before I do. She had arranged these words over the course of the afternoon, shaped them while feeding the fire and washing the cups, tested them against the honest version of what she meant. Arthur asked me in that letter to find the man he actually was, to know him if I could. She paused. I think I do now. Some part of him, the part you knew and kept here. I'm grateful for that in a way I don't have language for yet. Silas was very still. What I'm less grateful for, she said, is watching a man who was asked by 2 people to live, actually live, not exist in a workshop at 2 in the morning, with a piece of cedar and an unpayable debt, spend 5 years making excellent furniture for nobody. She said it without the heat of the afternoon, without the sharpness that had sent him to the workshop. gentler for being meant rather than deployed, which sometimes made things land harder. You are not honoring them. She said it again quieter. You are using their memory as permission to stay still. Arthur didn't die so that you could spend the rest of your life being sorry he died. Something gave way in Silas' vein then. Not dramatically, not the visible collapse that happened in stories with sounds and motion and the theater of breaking. It gave way the way a knot gave way when the tension on both ends released simultaneously, small, complete, almost imperceptible from the outside. He looked at the fire. He let out a breath that was longer than ordinary breathing required. I know, he said. 2 words quiet as the room around them. She turned back to the fire herself. They sat like that for several minutes, the clock on the mantel marking time in the absence of anything else that needed marking. Then Silas said the children in this valley ride 2 hours to the nearest school when the roads are passable. 3 months last winter, they didn't go at all. He said it in the same practical register he used for roof pitch calculations and frost line data. Not an emotional appeal, a statement of conditions. I have materials for a second building. The flat ground on the south side of the valley catches the best winter light. Footings could go in by March if the ground cooperates. He looked at her with the directness that she had learned was how he expressed the things he meant most. This isn't me asking you to stay. I understand you have a position and an obligation and a life you're correctly going back to. This is me saying that if you were willing when you're settled in Copperfield, when you know the situation there, the valley might also be worth considering. She recognized the precision of what he was doing. He wasn't asking her to give up what she was moving toward. He was asking whether what she was moving toward might eventually have room for this as well. It was a careful distinction, the distinction of a man who built things to last rather than to impress, who understood that sound construction required patience and the right sequence, and not rushing the pour before the ground was ready. You would need to come to Copperfield, she said, to let me know the building's progress, to discuss the arrangement. A beat, perhaps more than once. A project of that scope typically requires ongoing consultation. It typically does, he agreed. Something had shifted in the quality of the almost smile it had arrived finally in full. Not the brief precursor she'd seen on the first night, not the preparation for itself. The completed thing unhurried. It changed his face in a way that made her understand why Arthur had teased him about Owen, why the 3 of them had made the particular unit they'd made, why some configurations of people were greater than the sum of what each person brought alone. She looked back at the fire before the smile could do more work on her than was currently appropriate. In the morning, she said, and he said in the morning, and that was where they left it. She woke to a sky that had cleared in the night with the absolute finality of mountain weather, not gradual, not apologetic, simply finished. The snow on the ground lay deep and settled, the kind you could move through with a sound horse. She dressed and went to the stable before coffee, before anything else, because Drum came first. The swelling above the fetlock had reduced significantly overnight. The mare put weight on the leg with only the suggestion of hesitation, a slight preference rather than an avoidance, which was different enough from yesterday to mean something. Better Wren told her, running her hand down the leg. Drum pulled at the hay with the unconcerned appetite of an animal that had made its own assessment and agreed. She packed her saddlebags with the economy she'd developed over years of ranch work. Nothing unnecessary, everything in its place, the weight distributed correctly. The room she'd used was returned to the condition she'd found it, in quilt-folded washstand, dried the lamp oil replaced from the bottle in the kitchen cupboard. She left a coin on the small shelf beside the basin. She carried her bags to the main room. Silas was at the table with coffee and the architectural drawings, which she had come to understand were his version of morning reading, the thing he did in the early hours when his mind needed occupation before the day offered any. He looked up when she came in. On the table beside the coffee pot sat a cloth-wrapped parcel, modest, tied with a length of leather cord. He pushed it toward her without preamble. Cornbread for the ride, he said. The Valley Road has one exposed stretch about 4 miles out where the creek bends north and the wind comes straight through the gap. Move through it quickly, don't let the horse slow. She sat for a last cup. He poured it without being asked. They sat at the table the way they had sat at it across 5 days now. with the ease of two people who had arrived at a particular and temporary understanding of each other's rhythms. Not familiarity, nothing as settled as that, but the beginning of a map. "Tell me one thing about Arthur you haven't told me," she said. He looked at his cup. He didn't answer immediately, which she had learned meant he was deciding whether to answer at all, not deciding what the answer was. "There was a night in the fall of 1863, he said finally. "Below Gallows Pass before Owen, before any of it. Cold night, clear sky. Owen was asleep. Arthur and I were sitting up with the last of the fire, neither of us talking. Out of nowhere, Arthur said, and he wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the fire, the way he sometimes looked at things when he was going to say something true. He said, 'The thing I'm most afraid of isn't dying. The thing I'm most afraid of is that she'll grieve the right way, and then she'll be fine, and I'll find out I wasn't necessary to her at all.'" Wren's throat tightened. "I told him that was the most self-defeating fear I'd ever heard anyone admit to out loud," Silas said. He laughed. Said probably, but that it was the truth, and he'd rather say a true thing than a reasonable one. He looked at her. "I've thought about that sometimes. Whether he would have found it comforting or unbearable to know that you weren't fine." She set her cup down. She arranged the words carefully, the way she arranged the things that mattered most. "Tell him," she said. "Tell him I was not fine. Tell him that for 6 months I moved furniture at midnight and sold the ranch he built and am riding into a blizzard toward a schoolhouse full of strangers because I needed somewhere new enough to learn rather than remember. Tell him," her voice stayed level, more resolve than grief in it, "now that if being necessary was what he was afraid of losing, he can rest." Silas looked at her across the table for a long moment, both eyes carrying what they always carried, but carrying it differently now. Some of the weight redistributed, some of it set down. He nodded once slowly, the nod of a man who intended to carry something with care. She stood. She put on her coat and her gloves and her hat. She picked up her saddlebags, the wrapped cornbread. At the door she stopped. The daguerreotype was still on the mantel, still face down as it had been every day she'd been here except for the moment Silas had held it. She set her bags down. She crossed to the mantel. She picked up the frame and looked at it properly for the first time. 3 men in Union uniforms, the image brown-toned with age. Arthur's face was so specifically his that looking at it was like looking at something she had memorized rather than remembered. The slight squint that meant he was in direct sunlight, the way his shoulders sat, the particular angle of his jaw when he was at ease. Owen beside him, young enough that boyhood hadn't fully left his face yet. Something generous and unguarded in his expression, even in the stillness of a posed photograph. Silas on Arthur's other side, 15 years younger, the silver not yet arrived in his hair. The mismatched eyes visible even in the sepia, looking directly at the camera with the expression of a man who had decided to look directly at things and see what they did. All 3 of them were smiling. She placed the frame back on the mantel, upright, angled toward the window where the morning light came in best. 3 faces looked out into the room. She didn't look at Silas when she did it. She didn't need to. She heard the quality of a person standing very still while something moved through them, the sound a room made when someone in it stopped bracing against something. "They should be seen," she said. She picked up her bags. She went to the door. Ren. Her name in his voice, she had heard it only a few times, each time with the slight quality of something being tested for what it would hold. She turned. He was standing near the table, not moving toward her, respecting the distance she hadn't articulated, but had established, his hand extended. The cedar piece. Arthur's name in clean, careful letters on the smooth face. "You should have this," he said. "I made it to have somewhere to put it, somewhere outside my own head. But you need it more than I do, and I think you know where to put it." She crossed back to him. She took the piece of cedar from his hand. The wood was warm from where he'd been holding it. She closed her fingers around it. She left without saying anything more, because what needed saying had been said in the taking of it, in the weight of warm cedar moving from one hand to another, in the fact that she closed the door gently behind her rather than letting it fall. Drum was ready. The mare picked her way up through the settled snow, with none of the previous hesitation, the bad leg holding well in the cold, the footing firm beneath the white surface. Wren didn't look back at the cabin as she climbed out of the valley's cup. She wasn't avoiding it. She simply didn't need to. Iron Bell Valley was already inside her in the way that mattered, the way places got inside you when something true had happened in them, when you'd been changed by them enough that the geography became internal. The cedar pressed against her ribs through the coat pocket with every stride of the horse. Arthur's name cut in the dark by a man who couldn't sleep. She had carried Arthur's sealed letter for 6 months and hadn't opened it. She had been afraid of what it would cost her to read it, and she had been right to be afraid, and she was glad she had read it anyway. The exposed stretch Silas had warned her about was exactly where he said it would be. 4 miles out, the valley narrowed and the creek bent north, and the wind came through the gap with a directness that had nothing gentle in it, not violent, simply indifferent. The wind doing what wind did in the passes, without any opinion about whether she was there. She leaned forward slightly, let Drum find the pace, kept her eyes on the far edge of the exposed stretch, where the tree line resumed and the wind stopped. That was how you took difficult ground. You didn't look at the full length of it. You looked at where it ended, and you moved steadily, and at some point you looked up and the trees were around you again. The road to Copperfield opened as she cleared the last stand of pine. The land flattened, the tracks of the wagon train visible in the hardened snow ahead of her. They had made it through her wagon train, the people she'd been traveling with when Gallows Pass had separated them. By now they were settled in Copperfield, warm, their crisis resolved. Martin Howell had probably told the story of the woman with the lame horse, had probably told it with the particular brevity of a man who felt something about how it had ended and didn't care to examine what. She thought she didn't mind. Her sister Margot met her at the edge of town with the expression of someone who had cycled through worry and relief and landed on relief hard enough to make it look almost like anger. She had Wren's arms in both hands before Wren was fully off the horse. Martin Howell had told them. The bluff. The shoe. Where was she? Was she all right? What had happened? She was fine, Wren said. She had found shelter in the valley below the pass. A man named Silas Vane, he had been acquainted with Arthur from the war. He'd been kind enough to take in a stranded woman and a lame horse. Margot looked at her with the attention of an older sister who had been reading her face her whole life and was reading it now, finding things that hadn't been put there for finding. Are you all right? She asked again differently. Yes, Wren said. Better than I was a week ago in ways I'll explain when I have the words for them. Margot, to her credit, didn't push. She had always understood the difference between a secret and something that needed more time to become language. The teaching position was confirmed. The schoolroom attached to the back of the Methodist church had windows on both sides for the winter light, a stove, a reasonable set of readers the previous teacher had left behind. The previous teacher had left in August for reasons the school board explained with the careful economy of people who had decided the less said the better, which Wren understood to mean there had been some difficulty that had resolved itself through departure, and they did not intend to repeat the experience. She would start Monday. It was Thursday. She spent 3 days with Margot and Margot's husband, Delt Hargrove, a wagon maker who read the newspaper fully each evening and asked sensible questions when he had them. She liked him for the restraint that implied. On the second evening, she took Arthur's letter from the book she had stored it in and read it again, this time for what it said rather than for the experience of reading it. When she finished, she folded it back into thirds and placed it inside the cover of the Wyoming History, the one with Arthur's inscription that she'd taken from her trunk when she arrived. She set the cedar piece on top of the folded letter on the small shelf above her bed. She sat on the edge of the mattress and looked at the cedar in the lamplight for a long time. The letters were clean, precise, every stroke decided before it was made. She understood that better now than she had when she first saw them. Understood what it meant to cut something permanent into wood rather than write it on paper. The difference between a record and a marker, between something you could fold away and something that held its shape in 3 dimensions and didn't change when you looked away. Silas had made a marker the same way Arthur had made one for Owen in the dark, by something closer to feeling than sight. She had not expected to understand that the way she understood it. 14 children arrived the first Monday morning, ranging from 6 to 15. 3 siblings from the Prewitt family arrived together with the collective expression of children who had been disappointed by adults before and weren't prepared to extend confidence prematurely. She respected that and didn't try to overcome it by being pleasant. She taught them something true on the first day, the actual mechanism of how rivers cut through stone, with a diagram on the chalkboard that connected to the land they walked on every day, and she let the interest come from the subject. By Wednesday, she had their attention. By Friday, two of the pre-wit children stayed after to ask about the next lesson. She wrote to Silas on Saturday. She wrote it at Margot's kitchen table in the hour before anyone else was awake, in the specific early morning quiet when thought moved without the usual friction. She told him about the schoolroom, its dimensions, window placement, existing inventory of texts. She told him what it needed: 2 additional tables built to a lower working height for the youngest children who couldn't manage the standard desk, a proper shelf unit for the books currently stacked in an arrangement she would describe as optimistic, a cabinet with a lock to keep teaching materials dry through winter. She included her measurements taken the afternoon before, precise enough that someone who knew what they were doing could work from them directly. At the end, she wrote, "The children in this valley deserve the same instruction as the children in any other. If you build something on the south-facing flat, I'll come in the spring to discuss what it needs. Bring the architectural drawings when you come to Copperfield. I want to see what you've planned." She didn't write about the daguerreotype or the letter or the cedar piece on her shelf. Those things had happened in Iron Bell Valley and belonged to it. Correspondence was for what came next. She sealed the letter and left it with the postmaster, a brisk man named Adler, who had run the Copperfield mail operation since before the town had been large enough to require one. He looked at the address on the envelope with the expression of a man who knew his roots. "Iron Bell Valley," he said. "The man who comes in once a season for supplies. Stays maybe an hour, pays in cash, doesn't linger." He looked at her over his spectacles. "You know him." She'd met him during the storm, she said. He'd been kind enough to provide shelter when Drum went lame at the pass. Adler stamped the envelope with the efficiency of a man who had stamped 10,000 envelopes and found them equally interesting. He could send it with the Whitmore boy who rode the South Valley route, or hold it for when Silas came in for supplies next month. "The Whitmore boy, please," Wren said, "if it wasn't too much trouble." Adler said it wasn't. 3 weeks after her arrival in Copperfield, on a Tuesday morning, when the temperature had dropped enough that the children's breath was visible in the schoolroom, until the stove caught, she looked through the east-facing window. Between one sentence she was writing on the chalkboard and the next, and saw a flatbed wagon on the street outside. Not a supply wagon, not the general merchant's weekly delivery. A working flatbed with boards stacked and secured with the care of someone who understood that the material they were transporting was going to become something, and something that needed to arrive in usable condition. The horse pulling it was a large bay gelding with the patient chest and the steady eyes of an animal that had covered serious ground without complaint. She knew that horse. She finished the sentence on the chalkboard. She explained the punctuation marks she'd just written. She assigned the practice exercise. She told the older Prewitt boy to help anyone who needed it. She went to the door. Silas was standing beside the wagon with his hat in his hand, looking at the front of the school building, with the expression he used when he was assessing a structure: professional, evaluating, taking in the window placement, and the eave line, and the angle of the foundation from the street. He had a roll of drawings under his arm. He looked up when she came to the door. He looked at her with both eyes, the mismatched pair, the brown one and the green one, and the expression on his face was not the precursor to the almost smile. It was something past that, something that had arrived and was not going anywhere. She came down the 2 steps from the door. She stood on the cold street. "The furniture inventory," she said. "I was specific about the measurements." "You were," he said. He turned to look at the wagon bed. "The tables are built to the dimensions you specified. The shelf unit requires installation. I'll need access to the wall studs. The cabinet needs a threshold piece to keep moisture out. I can do that on site. How long will installation take?" He considered with the seriousness of a man who didn't give estimates he couldn't support. 2 days if the walls are what I'd expect from a building this age. 3 if there are surprises. "I have a room at the boarding house on Clement Street," she said, not looking away from him. "I spoke with Mrs. Hargrove about a second room. She keeps a good table. I brought the drawings," he said, "for the Valley Schoolhouse. I've made adjustments based on the frost line data from the past 4 winters. We could look at them this evening. She glanced back at the schoolroom window, where she could see the top of the older Prewitt boy's head bent over the practice exercise. I have 2 more hours before I can leave. He looked at the wagon at the building at her, the look of a man who had arrived somewhere after a long approach and was taking a moment to confirm that the ground was what it appeared to be solid, worth building on, worth the careful work of the next thing. "I'll start unloading," he said. She went back up the steps. At the door, she stopped, one hand on the frame. "Silas," he looked up from the wagon. "Thank you for coming." He settled his hat back on his head. "The Valley children deserve the same instruction," he said. A pause measured exactly the right length. "I also told you the project would require ongoing consultation." She went inside to her class. Through the east-facing window, between explaining the lesson to the youngest Prewitt child who had raised her hand with a question about rivers, Wren could see him in the street. The careful, unhurried work of a man unloading things he had made for a purpose, carrying them toward a building that would be filled with children who didn't know yet what was coming for them, in the form of tables built to the right height, shelves that would hold the books that would take them places, a cabinet with a lock that would keep the tools of their education dry through every winter after this one. She turned back to the lesson. She picked up the chalk. The mountains around Copperfield caught the afternoon light the way high country caught it in winter, low sideways, making long shadows across the snow that turned ordinary things into something with more dimension than they had in direct light. The shadow of the wagon on the street outside stretched almost to the far boardwalk. The shadow of the man carrying boards stretched further. Arthur had written, "I'd like you to know him if you can. I think you'd find him worth knowing." She had. She did. The knowing was not finished. It was the kind of knowing that had just started, the early part, where you had the shape of a person, but not yet the full territory, where every conversation added something that shifted what you'd thought you understood and made room for more. That was the part she had always found worth the difficulty of it, the part where a person was still becoming knowable. She wrote the next sentence on the board. Outside in the cold street, the work went forward, the careful sound of boards being set down on a solid surface, the creak of the wagon bed relieved of weight by degrees, the sound of something being built by someone who understood what it meant to build things, meant to last. She stayed until the last student left. She put on her coat and picked up her bag and went to the door. The wagon stood empty in the street, the bay gelding patient at the hitching post. She stepped down to the street and walked to the schoolroom door and went inside. He was checking the wall anchors on the shelf unit, his back to the room, one hand on the wood, and one testing the bracket in the way of someone confirming, not that the work was done, but that it was done correctly. The table stood at the height she had specified. She crossed to the nearest one and placed her hand flat on the surface. The wood was smooth under her palm, not finished smooth, but work smooth, the kind of surface that came from attention rather than product from someone who had taken the time the material required. She could feel the grain beneath her fingers, the specific character of this piece of wood, the way it had grown and been shaped, and would take on the marks of the children who used it over years, the ink and the scratches and the weight of small elbows on winter mornings. Some things hold, she thought. That is all they need to do. She pressed her hand more firmly against the wood and stood in the low winter light coming through the east-facing window and felt for the first time in 6 months the specific quality of stillness that was not grief stillness. Not the stillness of something stopped. The stillness of something at rest because it had arrived somewhere. Behind her, she heard him step back from the shelf. She heard him turn. She didn't move her hand from the table.